The world's weird, and we need to talk about weird stuff that's been happening. So, first step. What does it say about elections in the Constitution? Remember, when you're talking about the Founding Fathers and why they did a lot of what they did, much of it is to prevent the rise of tyranny, to make sure that some president didn't try to set themselves up as a king or a dictator and ignore the will of the people and all that. So it's how do we protect ourselves from tyranny? So, for example, I think we already talked about Founding Fathers didn't want the U.S. to have a standing army because they were afraid of what the president would do with it. So what do we do to prevent tyranny? All right. So Article 2 of the Constitution, which is about the president, says, each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors. So originally, the state legislatures picked all the electors and nobody voted for George Washington. But after George Washington left the White House, states started letting people vote for the electors. Okay? And that's what we do in all the states now. We have a popular vote. The winner gets to pick the electors. Related to that is the 10th Amendment. And the 10th Amendment says, the power is not delegated to the United States, but the Constitution prohibited by the states are reserved to the states for the people. That line in Article 2 is all there is in elections in the Constitution, the original Constitution. Therefore, everything else about elections belongs to the states. So we've had a bunch of lawsuits. And the lawsuits are about the fact that we had this pandemic. Now, there's all these, there was fraud. Well, there's hardly been any lawsuits over fraud. Few. Half the time when the judge asks for evidence of the fraud, they just have withdrawn the lawsuit. The other half of the time, they've given them statements from people who saw things. Okay? And the judges have gone through it. Don't let anybody tell you they never looked at the evidence. Every single piece of evidence, there's long stuff written by judges. And most of the judges have been very rude to the people who filed these lawsuits about how bad their evidence is. There's just no evidence of significant fraud. And remember that the Department of Homeland Security said this has been the most secure election in history, and the Justice Department looked for fraud, and they couldn't find any. Okay? The rules changed, though. States changed their rules because of the pandemic, and these lawsuits are mostly coming after people have already voted. And it turns out there's two parts to this that matter. One is who changed the rules? Who has the right to decide how elections are handled? State legislatures, okay? And then courts, once people have already voted, courts do not like to throw out their votes. Just do not, okay? Courts want to stick with the vote the way it was. So the Supreme Court took a lot of cases before the election to during the election, and there's a whole bunch more cases that are going to end up probably at the Supreme Court. Among those, who can change the law to allow everyone to do mail-in voting? Well, only the legislature, right? Not a governor, not a secretary of state, only the legislature. So there have been a bunch of lawsuits around that. Some legislatures decided to use mail-in voting, but if an individual decides to allow mail-in voting for everyone, they have to do it within the context of the law. All right? And so there's been a bunch of lawsuits about that. Trump administration won one of them and lost all the rest. Change the dates that ballots are due. Okay, well, that's partly related to number one. When do you have to get your stuff in? And again, there's a Pennsylvania law, and Trump actually won that lawsuit. That's the one he's won out of 60. But Pennsylvania had already set those ballots aside. Pennsylvania wasn't sure that what they had done was legal, and so they never counted those ballots that got thrown out. So it didn't change the outcome of the vote in Pennsylvania because they never counted them. Okay? And the Democrats have sued. Can you limit the number of drop boxes? The governor of Texas says we're going to have one drop box for the whole city of Houston for 10 million people. We're just going to have one because they're all Democrats. Can you do that? Okay. Remember, who owns elections? Legislatures. Then we had this deal. Can you sue other states? Can one state sue another state? Texas sued other states. Guess what? One, they have no standing. They can't sue. It was one of the shortest decisions in the history of the Supreme Court. Texas can't sue other states because they don't like the outcome of their election. Then, will the Supreme Court overrule a state legislature? So we already know that if an individual does something from all those cases that we had, if a governor or a secretary of state or a county election official changes their rules in a way that violates what the legislature said, that's illegal, and they can get in trouble for that. The Trump administration asked the Supreme Court to overrule the Pennsylvania legislature. Well, the Supreme Court was having none of that. Okay? They have been pretty clear that it's the state legislature that's the key to all of this. Okay, so there's a bunch of lawsuits still coming. If you think the lawsuits are over, no. Can they change the outcome of the election? No. But they can change what happens in future elections. So Georgia allowed drive-through voting, not drive in and drop off your ballot, but drive-through voting. There's a lawsuit about that. There's a lawsuit about adding drop boxes. There's a lawsuit about taking drop boxes away, the one drop box in Texas thing. There's also a lawsuit against the post office. You know that President Trump appointed a postmaster, and he took out mail sorting machines and intentionally slowed down the mail. So there's a lawsuit about that still working its way through the court system. There's a whole bunch of them. All right, some things. Once you take a popular vote, the Supreme Court has said you cannot change and pick your electors another way. So, again, the Trump administration has asked in Georgia and in Pennsylvania and other places, they said, Governor, don't take it, send different electors because you know there was cheating. Well, that's unconstitutional. According to the Supreme Court, that is unconstitutional. If you allow that vote, once the voters vote, you can't undo it. And this is a constant theme through these. Once you vote, even if the vote was done in an illegal way, the courts are hesitant to undo the vote. All right. Now, we had the day of the insurrection on Capitol Hill, and Congress that day was in the process of doing what it's supposed to do under the 12th Amendment. The words that are up here are actually in the original Constitution, but they were replaced. Some of the other words that were in the original Constitution were replaced by the 12th. Electors used to vote for two people, and the one who got the most votes was the president, and the one who came in second was the vice president. That was uncomfortable for people, as you can imagine, that you could have a vice president who was your arch enemy. So 12th Amendment changed all that, and you vote once for president and once for vice president. Okay, but let's read the 12th Amendment. The president of the Senate shall, and the president of the Senate is the vice president of the United States. In the president of the Senate and the House of Representatives, open all the votes shall then be counted. The person having the greatest number of votes for president shall be president, if the number be a majority of the whole number of electors appointed. Okay? The president shall, the president of the Senate, open all the certificates, and the votes shall be counted. it doesn't say the House and the Senate will approve. It says they will count. And the person getting the most votes shall be president. So what we saw, though, was senators and congressmen getting up and objecting to the votes. Now, the objection procedure dates from, it's not in the Constitution, and it dates from the 1870s, where the southern states wanted to get back to discriminating against people of color. And so they sent in, one of the southern states sent in two sets of electors, two different sets of electors. Okay, so how do you count when there's a question? So there was a huge fight, and it ended up with the person who was president of the United States agreeing to remove the U.S. Army from the South, and that's how we got a lot of bad stuff going on in the South. But it's about, the election procedure is not about the Senate approving them. The Senate and the House don't approve anything. So what do they do? This is what the law says. That there's the objections and how the objections are handled, and I'm skipping that part. The law says no electoral vote or votes from any state which shall have been regularly given, lawfully certified, from which there is but one return, shall be rejected. Okay? If there's only one piece of paper from the states, and in this case, each state had submitted one piece of paper lawfully signed by their governor, they cannot be rejected. So that whole thing in Congress, while they were doing that, was for show. It had no legal or constitutional validity of any kind, and it would not have worked. It didn't matter how many Republicans voted against the stuff that was there. If the Supreme Court follows the Constitution and follows the laws of the United States, it was all for show. It was just for Republicans to, just for Republicans to do something, right? Congress does that a lot, just does things for show. That's what that was. Now, there is actually federal election law, and if you're like, huh? Nowhere in the Constitution does it. Well, federal election law is empowered by the 14th Amendment, and we'll talk about the 14th Amendment a lot when we get to amendments. The 14th Amendment says no person shall be denied equal protection under the law. So the 14th Amendment is about equal protection, and federal election law is about equal protection. It's about making sure that all persons are treated equally. And it makes election contributions, for example, open, some of them, and we'll talk about that. But if you're running for office and I give you $1,000, there's a report of that goes to the Federal Election Commission. So there's stuff. But the other thing that's in that 14th Amendment is this no person thing. What it says is that anyone who participates in an insurrection cannot be a senator or a congressman. Ooh. Well, if it turns out that senators and congressmen did in fact take groups of the insurrectionists on tours the day before and show them where other people's offices were, they could theoretically be removed from the Senate or the House under the 14th Amendment. That amendment also, by the way, says that if your state is caught trying to deny people the right to vote who have the right to vote, your state can lose electors. Ooh. It's a big penalty. They've never done it, but they could. So the Republicans stormed the Capitol because I think the election is being stolen. The Democrats are 100% positive that the 2000 election was stolen from them, and they handled it much differently. Bush v. Gore. In the year 2000, the only time a presidential election has been decided by the Supreme Court. They picked the winner. Okay, and we need to talk about Bush v. Gore. So the fun part of this is something called a butterfly ballot. In a butterfly ballot, you have the names of people on two sides, and you have to cast your vote in the middle. Now, what you do in this vote, and we used to do this in Nevada, and it's ridiculously silly. There is a piece of cardboard, printed up piece of cardboard, underneath that middle yellow part. And you take that thing over, that blue thing over on the right-hand side, and you literally punch through the cardboard to cast your vote. So there's these punch cards, these little cards, cardboard cards. Okay? Well, everybody knew that these punch systems didn't work and they shouldn't have been using them. And B, this butterfly ballot is... So there were thousands of people who double voted. Not very many for George Bush, because look, his thing is kind of on its own. Al Gore, on the other hand, has Pat Buchanan in the middle of his space. So there's thousands of double votes. This ballot was only used in a few counties. It wasn't used across the whole state. It was only used in a few counties. And like all of the Buchanan votes in the whole state end up coming, not that bad, but huge numbers of Buchanan votes end up coming just from these counties where Al Gore is. And then we have something called hanging chads. So the people who make up these ballots, the people who are running this election, are all Republicans after the election's over. And Florida's going to decide the election, right? Neither one of the candidates has the 270 votes. So whoever's going to win Florida is going to be president. Al Gore wants recounts. He wants to try to fix these ballots. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of ballots out there that aren't counted, that are probably every Democrat on the planet Earth is certain that if 100% of all the legally cast ballots in Florida were counted that year, Al Gore wins. During the process of recounts and all that, the Democrats, or the Republicans rather, go to the Supreme Court and say, oh, no, of course, it was a beautiful election in Florida. Well, in the end, the Supreme Court rules for the Republicans 5-4. The 5 Republican judges voting for the Republicans and the 4 Democrat judges voting for the Democrats, which blew up anybody who ever thought that the Supreme Court was above politics, right? And the result by 5-4, which Lindsey Graham pointed out the other day in Congress, that if Al Gore could accept 5-4, he could accept the Wisconsin Supreme Court going 4-3. 5-4, George W. Bush is president of the United States.